Hey gang, and welcome back. By now you've most likely seen the 4 other deck reveals on various channels, so I'm going to keep mine brief and to the point. My deck reveal is for the Temur deck, and it's the aptly named Tinker Time, as it's heavily based around artifacts and using them. You may have already seen the face card for this deck, but if not, it's Gimbal, Gremlin Prodigy. I'm really excited to see more gremlin creatures hitting the field, and for only 5 mana this legendary creature does a lot for an artifact based deck. First off, its static ability gives all of our artifact creatures trample. It has a second ability as well that triggers on our end step, and allows us to create a 0/0 red gremlin artifact token, and we then get to put X+1/+1 counters onto it, where X is the number of differently named artifact tokens we control, which is a bit of an odd, but simultaneously interesting ability. Not only do we want to run a lot of differently named artifacts, we also want to have ways to make them into tokens, to be able to get massive gremlins at the end of turn. This should lead to some pretty interesting card choices, and I'm excited to see what people are able to brew up. Art-wise, I love the colors, like the blue, I like the purple, and it looks like he's trying to adapt or convert or upgrade another gremlin like himself. The flavor text is also particularly fun and kind of feels in line with Is It? And reads, "You are what you eat, and everything he'd eaten was brilliant." The second phase commander is one of those awesome pairings that we've seen being released in March of Machines, and this time it's Rashmi and Ragavan. These awesome Kaladesh partners, these amazing Kaladesh legendaries have wreaked havoc on their own, so combining them can only mean fun things. Their ability reads, whenever you cast your first spell during each of your turns, exile the top card of target opponent's library and create a treasure token. This is kind of a hybrid of Rashmi's ability, casting your first spell and getting your exiled first card, and Ragavan's when you connect, exiling your opponents. What makes it even better than their 2 abilities on their own is the extra clause added to it, which allows us to cast that exiled spell, assuming we have more artifacts than its mana cost. If we don't, we still get to cast it, although we have to pay for it. Again, thematically we have nice blue and purples as highlight colors, and we get to see Rashmi in battle with a cute little Ragavan perched on her shoulder. The next rare I want to talk about is a Cutthroat Negotiator. Costing 4 mana, we get a 4/3, and we see the triumphant return of Parlay. This ability triggers whenever the Cutthroat Negotiator attacks, and it has each opponent revealing their top cards of their library. For each non-land card revealed this way, we get to create a tapped treasure token, but we're not the only ones to benefit, as basically each opponent gets to draw that card as well. Thematically, I think this card is a home run, as it's basically some aggressive negotiations, allowing us all to draw cards, but we also get the benefit of getting some tapped treasures to help us ramp next turn. And I like how the art depicts basically what's happening in the game, which is that we're intimidating opponents, although they're still getting something out of it. And we obviously can't overlook that fun Phyrexian symbol in the middle of the map. Another fun rare is Dance with Calamity. It allows us to shuffle our library, which is something I really want to do for 8 mana, but thankfully it has more than just that. As many times as we want, we can exile the top card of our library, and as long as the total mana value of the cards exiled this way is 13 or less, we can then cast any number among them without paying their mana cost. Obviously this is a high risk, high reward, kind of like Ad Nauseam, where you don't want to go too deep and not be able to have enough life total, or in this case converted mana cost, to be able to do it. I think the art perfectly showcases this, which is that you can basically get a lot of power, but also simultaneously burn yourself by getting too greedy. Our next rare from Tinker Time also has an artifact ability, and that's the Pain Distributor. It is a menace for a 2/3 for 3 mana, which is pretty decent. But its more important ability is that whenever a player casts their first spell, they create a token. Now this is a symmetrical effect, meaning that our opponents will also benefit from it. However, thankfully Pain Distributor lives up to its name, and it will hurt our opponents, as whenever an artifact goes into their graveyard from the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to that player. This could also be kinda cool by giving it Infect, and kill them with Infect for getting greedy. Art-wise, again, we see a nice little bit of purple and blue in the background, but we also see a lot of red because it's a devil, and I think we find ourselves on New Capenna, as this gives us some really big Riveteer vibes. Next up, we have a rare version of Explosive Vegetation with Path of the Animist. We've got some sweet Nissa action going on in this beautiful art, lots of greens, lots of swirls, lots of foresty stuff. I kinda love it, and much like Explosive Vegetation, for 4 mana, we get to go and find 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. What makes this into a rare though, is the fact that it has Will the Planeswalkers. This is an interesting mechanic and probably one of the first times we've seen it, as it allows us to choose either Planeswalk or Chaos without having to roll the dice in a Planechase game. It allows each player to put a vote of either Planeswalk or Chaos, and depending on which gets more votes, you basically do that. which is kinda nice as opposed to having to rely on rolling away to get away from that plains. Hailing from what I can only assume is the plains of Tarkir, the Sandsteppe War Raiders are another 4-costing green rare. It's a 4/4 that has trample, and at the beginning of combat on our turn, we get to bolster X. The X once more cares about differently named artifact tokens we control, and that means that we really want to basically capitalize on having artifacts out and then making token copies of them. This ability will allow us to pump up our lowest creatures and make them into big threats potentially, so it's kind of fun to just have on the field, or if it's the only thing out, it'll get progressively bigger. We have yet another 4-mana rare, this time with Schema Thief. This 4-mana biker, Vodalcan rogue, artificer, space-time cool dude is basically a flying 3/3, but it does offer us one of those abilities that we really want for a lot of the cards in this deck, which is that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we get to make a token that's a copy of target artifact that they control. This means we aren't limited to making token copies of only artifacts we control. I like that they're basically flying over what looks like a Phyrexian attack, as we see some tendrils and some Elish Norn looking beasts in the background popping out and attacking. Thankfully, my trend of getting decks that have goblins continues, and the Hedron Detonator fills that role. This 3-mana Goblin Artificer is kinda gonna act like a Reckless Fire Mage. However, it only pings one opponent. That's still not bad though, but it does have even more upside, which allows us to sacrifice 2 artifacts. By doing so, we get to exile our top card of our library, and we're then able to play that card this turn. Whether that's a land, a spell, an artifact, a creature, this is probably some of the best card advantage we can get in red. We've also got an exciting, albeit a slightly expensive mana rock with an Ichor Elixir. It wouldn't be a plane chase deck without being able to somehow manipulate dice rolls, and the ability of this artifact is that whenever we have to roll a planar die, instead of rolling 1, we get to roll that many plus 1 and ignore one of them. This might not seem terribly relevant, but it'll mean that we can potentially hit a way to get off the plane that's causing us so much trouble, if we need it. Plus it taps for 2 colorless mana, which isn't bad. I will say though that the art and the flavor text unfortunately are kinda sad, as I loved Kaldheim, and this is basically depicting that they killed the World Tree and are manipulating it and using it to forward their Phyrexian goals. That's a bit of a bummer, but hopefully Ragavan can save the day. As you know, this is a plane chased EDH deck, so that means you're gonna get some plane chase cards. The first of which is Ghurapur. This city is on the plane of Kaladesh, and its ability is at the beginning of combat on our turn, until the end of each turn, each non-creature, non-vehicle artifact you control becomes a 5/3 vehicle in addition to its other types, plus it gains Trample, Haste, and Crew 2. The chaos side of it is you return target non-creature artifact card from our graveyard to our hand, so that's just pure upside. I could see this being a particularly favorite plane for something like Shorakai, or at least my version of it, as so much of the deck is based around vehicles. I think the art in this one in particular is gorgeous, as we get to see some pretty sweet cards from Kaladesh, mainly the Aetherflux Reservoir, which is that big building in the center, not to mention the Spire of Industry, which is the tower that's off in the top right. I think that's kinda cool to see those sweet little homages worked into a card like this. I just rolled a Planeswalk, so we're heading to Glimmervoid Basin. This takes place on Mirrodin, and its abilities whenever a player casts an instant or a sorcery spell with only a single target, that player copies that spell for each other spell, permanent, and card not on the battlefield, and or player the spell could target. This is going to get incredibly confusing, and makes me have nightmares of a game that I played with John back in New Jersey with Radiate. It blew my mind, and I don't think I've ever been the same. Furthermore, each copy targets a different one of them, so this is just going to get real weird real fast. Whenever chaos ensues, you get to choose target creature. Each player except the creature's controller then gets a token copy of that creature. This is particularly punishing, although, depending on the deck, like if you're running Beamtown Bullies, could lead to some pretty funny results. I always love the Plains cards because they give us a really nice insight or view of the Plains itself, and this is no different. We get to see the shimmer plains of Mirrodin, and it's beautiful with some kind of energy shooting off of it, which I'm assuming is the spell referenced in the ability. The Isle of Vesuva. Now, if you're familiar with Vesuva as a land itself, it will always come in as a copy of another land, and this kind of does the same, although with a slight tweak. And its ability reads, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, its controller creates a token that's a copy of that creature. This could be particularly spicy with a Blink-based deck, maybe something like Chulane could really benefit from it, although you have to be careful, as whenever someone rolls Chaos, that player gets to destroy target creature and all other creatures with the same name as that creature. I'm not terribly up to date on the lore of Dominaria, but I will say this is just a beautiful landscape. I love the water, it's got a nice castle in the background, and a cool sunset, which is just, pretty to look at. We didn't have to planeswalk very far, let alone actually walk far for this next one, as it's also on Dominaria, and that's New Archive. This has whenever a historic creature you control attacks, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Historic creatures are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas, although I can't say I remember being attacked by too many saga-based creatures. I'm probably just not aware of some of the card interactions, or it might be something like having Opalescence out and a saga, but it's cool to know that that's a possibility. Rolling Chaos in this Plains is actually pretty beneficial, as you're able to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a historic card. You get to put that card into your hand, and the rest is going to the bottom. This is just pure card advantage, which is pretty sweet. Next, we find ourselves on the plane of Ravnica, one of my absolute favorites, and it also happens to be a location for one of my favorite commanders, Tristani. This is the Selesnya Loft Gardens. It works super well with Tristani, might I add, which kind of makes sense, as if an effect would create one or more tokens, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. In addition, just like Doubling Season, if an effect would put one or more counters onto a permanent, it puts twice that many counters onto the permanent instead. This is just awesome, and I'm really excited to play this, and hopefully get to make a ton of Wovenmold Hydras. To make matters even better, is that whenever chaos ensues until the end of that turn, whenever a land gets tapped for mana, you get to add 1 mana of any type that land produced, meaning your land's tapped for 2. This is basically having Mirari's Wake and Doubling Season slapped together, although you do have to roll for it, but I am very, very excited to planeswalk here. I also like the serene cityscape of it all, with the beautiful architecture and the nice forestry blending in pretty seamlessly. One of my absolute favorite cards, the Furnace of Wrath, will deal double damage to my opponents, and the Stronghold Furnace is basically the Plains version of that, as we're traveling to Wrath. It reads if a source would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage instead. Simple as that. If you were going to take 1, you're now taking 2. It has a pretty straightforward ability when you roll Chaos, which is that it deals 1 damage to any target, which, because of its own ability, is actually 2. The art is also a callback to the Furnace of Wrath, so I think the card is just a home run in terms of theme and presentation. We now find ourselves planeswalking away to Ten Wizards Mountain. This is on the plane of Shen Meng, which unfortunately I'm not too familiar with. However, I don't have to be familiar with to know that this is a pretty sweet plains. Whenever we roll the planar die, even if we miss, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. This means whether we fail, get chaos, or whatever, one of your creatures is at least getting bigger. When you roll chaos for it, it's pretty sweet, as it can potentially allow you to Alpha Strike, as it gives all of your creatures flying until end of turn. Overall, I think this is a beautifully drawn out card, with just upside and upside and upside. The Western Cloud finds us in Gobakan, and it has a weird ability, and I'm curious to see how they want to work this out. Basically, we get to prevent all damage that would be dealt to creatures and planeswalkers we control, and whenever you roll Chaos, you get to create 3 tapped treasures, and they each deal 1 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. It's odd to see that treasures are dealing damage to creatures and planeswalkers, but also its ability presumably prevents that actually from happening, although I guess you'll still take damage if a creature hits you. Another plane I'm excited to revisit, not to mention with the upcoming set, is Eldraine, and we get to see that with the Wilds. This has that whenever we planeswalk to it, or in the beginning of our upkeep, we get to make a food token. That's pretty simple and straightforward. I like that. Hitting Chaos, however, is actually kind of beneficial as well, as it allows us to choose target player to sacrifice a creature. If they do, we get to make another food token. We get to make 2 food tokens, however, if they sacrificed a creature that's toughness was greater than 4. Art-wise, it looks like we've got a beautiful forest, and I think those little blue glowy bits are meant to represent hunting parties, as things are hunting people in the wilds. I'm not too sure. I'm curious to hear what you think though. And last but not least, this wouldn't be Plane Chase without a phenomenon. The phenomenon for this deck is Plane-Wide Disaster, and my goodness does it live up to its name. When you encounter the Plane-Wide Disaster, destroy all creatures. Once that's done, you planeswalk away to somewhere else, basically starting from scratch. I love the art on this one as we get to see so many fun kind of creatures. You got a goblin flying out there, what looks like a monkey, some kind of gargoyle, a knight, all kinds of good stuff getting blown up. Equal opportunity destruction. Alright, so looking at reprints, once more we've got kind of a bit of a mixed bag, which I think is what people come to expect with these precons. There are some kind of fun, interesting cards that go really well with the deck, some interesting inclusions, some not so great ones, And then stuff that you're like, oh, that's a fun idea. The number one card I was surprised to see in this deck, which now makes sense after I read it, was the Everquill Phoenix. I thought, why is there a Phoenix in this artifact-based deck? And that's because it makes a feather token that's also an artifact, which for a lot of the abilities where it cares about differently named artifact tokens, this is actually a really fun idea. I think this is great, and you know, it's a mutate card, so I'm kind of a fan of it. Of course, there is one of my absolute favorite cards in the last couple of years, which is the Academy Manufacturer. That just basically turns anytime you turn one clue token or a food token or a treasure token in, you get to have multiple of them, which is just great. And two additionally strong cards are the Tireless Tracker and Tireless Provisioner, which allow us to have flexibility whenever a land comes in by making food and treasure tokens or clue tokens. One of the cards I'd been thinking about adding to this deck until I actually read the deck list and realized it was already in there was Echo Storm, as this is basically what we want to do, as it creates tokens of target artifact that we control. Not only does it create a token, it can create multiple tokens sometimes depending on how often we've cast our commander. This is just a really good spell for the deck. You've also got some other just really generically good spells like Thoughtcast, which will typically be casting for only a blue to draw 2 cards, and Saheeli's Artistry is really good. Masterful Replication is also another fun card in the deck, and it's kind of like Brutaclad, where basically you're going to choose to either make 2 golems, or the more powerful effect is choose target artifact we control, and each other artifact we control becomes a token copy of that until end of turn. This means if we cast something like the earlier seen Thopter Assembly, which makes a bunch of Thopter tokens as it comes in, we can have all those 1/1s suddenly become 5/5s, meaning that we have 6 5/5 creatures swinging for a total of 30 damage just from one spell. And if that's not enough, you also have Rise and Shine, which is one of my absolute favorite cards ever since I got blown out by someone overloading this after having a board full of food tokens and just beating the table to death with food. I think that's just awesome, and I'm very excited to do it again. One of the mechanics I'm actually surprised with that isn't more included in the deck, as we only seem to have one card of it, is ways to make blood tokens, as they're artifacts as well. The only one I think I can find is the Vampire's Vengeance in this deck, and that just seems kind of like a bit of a miss. One of the artifacts I'm very excited to see, although it was just recently reprinted in Double Masters 2022, is Bloodforged Battle Axe, as it basically makes its own copy every time you connect with a player. You get to keep making more and more copies, which is just awesome, but unfortunately the abilities that care about differently named artifacts are probably not going to care how many Bloodforged Battle Axe you're going to have, because it's just going to care about the one time. The same could be said for Replicating Ring and Skyclave Relic. It's great that these cards have ways of making tokens of their own by themselves. Unfortunately though, you're not going to be able to get benefits from having multiple of them though, but it's still nice to have them included. I would say the card that I'm the most excited about, and you probably know this about me, is Curse of Opulence. I love this red enchantment. It gives us a way to make gold tokens, which again is a differently named token, and this used to be fairly expensive. It's nice to see it included, and it's just a great card to put onto an opponent to give incentive to other opponents to attack them, all the while getting more and more ramp. I do like the payoff of Gearpoor Aether Girid, as basically it means that all those tokens which we might want to sacrifice for mana or life gain or draw can basically be tapped later on for damage, which is just good versatility. We then come to the land base. I haven't included the basics, although there seems to be about 5 to 7 of each type, and yeah, it's basically what you come to expect. It's exciting to see the Snarls back in, and I'm actually really growing on the temples. I like Scry, it gives you decent advantage even though it comes in tapped, but it could probably still use a bit more work. Game Trail at least works with Cinder Glade, and Command Tower and Exotic Orchard are always fantastic cards and ones I'm never going to say no to. I just wish there was a little bit more. And that, my friends, is the full deck reveal for Tinker Time. When they revealed the colors for this deck, it's definitely not the archetype that I thought it would be, but I'm glad to see that they're experimenting with what colors can do, not to mention having fun designing up new commanders that care about specific things that we don't normally see. While this might not necessarily be your cup of tea, you can bet your bottom dollar that there's someone out there who's very excited to build this up, and I'm happy that they're happy. As always, a big thanks to Wizards of the Coast for sending me this free preview deck, and please be sure to let me know if you're planning on picking up this deck or one of the other ones in the comments down below.